You were a soldier on the Finnish border with the Soviet Union in 1939. It is a godforsaken landscape of snow, subarctic temperatures and fir trees, and it could well end up being your final resting place. Before you is a terrifying sight. Wave after wave of Soviet tanks and soldiers are pouring across the border. Artillery shells explode around you while machine gun bullets whiz through the air, seeming to barely miss you. Camouflaged in white to hide yourself against the snow, you frantically return fire against the invaders. A shell suddenly lands near you, lifting you up into the air. You fall to the ground, dazed, but miraculously unhurt. Above you, the sky seems filled with Soviet bombers and fighters. How Finland can resist such might. As you stagger to your feet, your commander roars to your unit, "You can run, but you will only die tired." There is no retreat or surrender. You must hold the line. I'm your host, James Barton, and this is Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
First few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada.
Ausgebeten. Wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Russia invades a neighbouring country to seize territory and install a puppet regime, believing it will be an easy victory. Hundreds of thousands of casualties later, it finds out this will be no walkover. Modern day Ukraine? Nope. Finland in 1939. Some things never seem to change. The Winter War, fought between Finland and the Soviet Union, has been overshadowed by World War II, yet it's truly a fascinating conflict with vital lessons for today. A minnow compared to the size and resources of the USSR, the Finnish David heroically resisted the full might of the Soviet Goliath, inflicting devastating casualties and humiliating the mighty Red Army. They would save their country, but at a price. First, let's set our scene. Finland is in the easternmost part of Scandinavia, sandwiched between Norway and Sweden to the west, and Russia to the east. It stretches from the Arctic Circle to the Baltic Sea. Previously controlled by Sweden, by the 19th century Finland was part of the Russian Empire of the Tsars. Yet even then, it was almost a separate entity within the empire, a duchy with its own laws and language. When the Russian Revolution occurred in 1917, Finland took its chance and declared independence, emerging as an independent nation for the first time. Though during the interwar period an uneasy peace reigned between Finland and the newly created Soviet Union, there was always the feeling of unfinished business on both sides. As darkness descended on the world throughout the 1930s, Finland's very existence would be called into question. This was the era of Hitler, Mussolini and Imperial Japan, of lawlessness in the international arena, of the stronger preying upon the weaker. For the Soviet Union and its dictator, the man of steel himself, Joseph Stalin, this was a time of dangers, but also opportunities. We tend to forget that Stalin and Adolf Hitler were briefly allies, yet in 1939 that's exactly what happened. Two powers who should hate each other ideologically signed a non-aggression deal called the Nazi-Soviet Pact. This contained a secret protocol that divided Eastern Europe between them, with Stalin being given much of the former territories that had been part of the Tsarist Empire. First, the Soviet Union would invade Poland shortly after Germany did, securing the eastern half of the country. Then it forced the Baltic states to allow Soviet bases on their territory. By 1940 they would be gobbled up as well into the Soviet Empire, and then, like the eye of Sauron in Lord of the Rings, Stalin's gaze slowly turned to Finland. Finland's very geography was regarded as a threat by Stalin. The Finnish border was only 19 kilometers away from Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg, the Soviet Union's second largest city and the cradle of the Russian Revolution. To protect it, Stalin wanted to push the border way back, saying, "There's nothing we can do about geography. Since Leningrad cannot be moved, we will have to move the border away from it." Demands for territory and basing rights soon followed, which became increasingly threatening as Finland refused. In the last round of negotiations, Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov raised his arm and pointed at the Finnish delegates, exclaiming, "Since we civilians don't seem to be making any progress, maybe it's the soldiers' turn to speak." War was coming. On November the 30th, Russian bombers descended on the Finnish capital of Helsinki, while 4 Soviet armies of over 450,000 men and thousands of tanks poured across the border. Stalin would send millions of his soldiers to subdue the tiny nation of only 3 million people. Imagine this. You're in Helsinki on that terrible day. The air raid sirens wail as you hear and feel the explosions getting closer and closer. You are hiding in your cellar as Russian bombers attempt to pound the city you love, the city where you are raising your family, into the ground. Your wife's face is white, and you can see the fear and tension she is feeling. She clings to your daughter, who has buried her face in your wife's dress. You fear the cellar will not hold up if there is a direct hit. Outside, it seems to go quiet. There's a pause in the bombing. Despite your wife's pleas, you have to see what is going on. As you emerge into the daylight, before you is a scene of chaos and destruction. Fires rage across the city. You can see the bombed-out buildings and frantic rescue efforts. Suddenly, you hear the noise of a plane again. Are they returning? You prepare to race back to the cellar when pieces of paper start to fall around you. Bemused, you grab one. Written in your language, it says, "Finnish comrades, we come to you not as conquerors, but as liberators of the Finnish people from the oppression of the capitalists and the landlords." They dare to call this liberation? Molotov denied the Soviets were bombing Finnish cities, claiming they were dropping loaves of bread for hungry Finnish workers. Finns sarcastically nicknamed the Soviet bombs Molotov's bread baskets. Soviet propaganda would be absolutely terrible throughout the war. The Soviet leadership were highly overconfident, boasting they would overrun Finland in just 2 weeks. A celebratory piece of music was commissioned, sweet on Finnish themes, filled with praise of Stalin, which would be played as Soviet troops paraded in triumph through Helsinki streets. Ivan Maysky, the Soviet ambassador to the UK, also boasted of how isolated the Finns were. Who would help? The Swedes? The British? The Americans? There is no way in hell. There will be a fuss and depressed, moral support, mining, whining. But troops, aircraft, cannons, and machine guns? No. Yet the image of overwhelming Soviet might was deceptive. In the 1930s, Stalin had launched huge purges of anyone who could possibly be a threat to him, including one of the Red Army. Over 50% of officers had either been shot or imprisoned. Those that remained were often servile flatterers of Stalin, terrified of taking the initiative and being denounced, often more scared of each other than the enemy. Personifying this was the man Stalin chose to lead the invasion, Marshal of the Soviet Union, Clement Voroshilov. A hard-riding, hard-drinking Civil War crony of Stalin's, he had been promoted far above his ability. A passionate believer that cavalry still dominated the battlefield, he dismissed tanks as a mere fad that had no future in warfare. Just before the Germans invaded the USSR, he even proclaimed that, "I personally believe that war is highly unlikely." He was good at denouncing his fellow officers, however. He personally signed 185 execution lists, the 4th highest at the whole Soviet leadership. Among the many officers that fell victim to him were those who had promoted the use of tanks, a devastating blow the Red Army struggled to recover from. Adding to the incompetence and chaos of the Soviet officer corps were the infamous commissars, civilian Communist Party officials placed in every unit to keep a watchful eye on the army. Every order issued had to be approved by them. This dual command structure would completely incapacitate entire units at times, as military officers argued with the commissars over orders. Morale was also terrible among the fighting men, poor conscripts who had no idea why they were invading Finland. One recently conscripted soldier asked his officer, "Tell me, why do we fight this war? Did not Comrade Voshalov declare at the party congress that we don't want an inch of other people's land, and we will not surrender an inch of ours? Now we are going to fight? For what? I do not understand. The local commissar punched him and told him to shut up. Not really helping morale. Soviet conscription and training also left little to be desired. Picture this scene in your mind's eye. You're a Soviet factory worker who has headed out to a local town to buy some shoes for your wife's birthday. After buying the shoes and leaving the store, you notice the town seems oddly quiet. Something feels wrong. Then you see why. Around the corner comes an obese and greasy-looking commissar, followed by 5 lackeys, thugs in uniform. Food is hardly plentiful in Russia. You wonder how he has become so large. It was a mistake to stare, however. He's seen you. Before you can make your escape, he commands his men to grab you, and then waddles over. Hoisting you up by your coat lapels, his face now inches from yours, he stinks of vodka. What have we here? Such a fine specimen of Soviet manhood. Why are you not marching to the aid of the oppressed Finnish working classes? Before you can reply, he laughs. Do not worry, comrade. You will be there by tonight. I will personally make sure of it. You realize you may not see your wife again. This is a real story. The soldier went into battle with the Finns after 1 hour's training and was taken prisoner. He still had his wife's shoes and his kit. Thankfully he would survive the war and get to go home to her. Compared to this, the Finnish people were highly motivated to defend their homeland and had an outstanding leader in Marshal Karl Gustav Mannerheim. A tall, handsome aristocrat who had been a general and something of a favourite under the last Tsar, he had led his country to independence. Ironically, he didn't learn Finnish until after it became independent. There was something inherently cool about Mannerheim. Descriptions of him remind me of a more refined version of the characters Clint Eastwood used to play. A perfect example is during a meeting with a high-ranking German officer. The German produced a large cigar and asked if it would bother the marshal if he smoked it. Mannerheim fixed the German with a piercing gaze that would penetrate armoured plate and cut him dead by replying evenly, "I don't know. No one has ever tried it." The battle-hardened German officer gulped and put away his cigar. Facing multiple invasions over a huge area, Mannerheim prioritized the border region next to Leningrad, known as the Karelian Isthmus, Stalin's main war aim. Across the isthmus, he had already built the Mannerheim Line, a series of trenches, tank traps, machine gun nests, and fortified bunkers, manned by most of the Finnish army. The Soviets lumbered towards the Mannerheim Line like a zombie army. Expecting a quick victory, the troops had been neither conditioned nor equipped for the frigid north and its thick forests, while the Soviets had no intelligence on the Finnish forces or even the terrain they faced. Disaster soon followed due to this complete lack of planning and overconfidence. Wave after wave of Soviet soldiers were thrown against the defences, leading to a mass slaughter more like the battles of the First World War than the Blitzkrieg or Lightning War of the Second. When Voshalov found out about the bloody stalemate at the Mannerheim Line, he ordered them to throw more men at the Finns, inevitably leading to heavy casualties for no gains. All the while, thousands of Soviet soldiers were either dying or losing limbs to frostbite. Let's join them for an attack. You ski through the dark forest with your comrades, all of you dressed in white winter clothing, so you blend into the endless snows. Up ahead you hear the rumble of tanks and trucks. You have found the Soviets. Silently you approach the convoy under the cover of darkness, a lethal shadow descending upon the unsuspecting Russians. You pull out a bottle filled with petrol and light the rag that serves as a fuse, and throw it at the leading Soviet tank. It bursts into flames as panic screams filled the air. Your comrades throw more bottles and open fire as the troops try to flee their vehicles. Taking out your rifle, you see an officer trying to organize the men. You aim, and with one shot, he falls to the floor. With the Soviets in chaos, it's time to pull back. You vanish into the forest, heading back to base. Behind you, the Russians waste ammunition firing into the forest around them, looking for targets that have long ago vanished into the darkness. Those bottle weapons were the now famous, or should I say infamous, Molotov cocktails, used in countless wars, action films, and riots since. This is where they got their name. The Finns darkly joked that as Molotov had supposedly dropped bread for them to eat, they would give him something to drink in return. Really got to love that Finnish sense of humour. Unable to break through the Mannerheim line, the Soviets tried to go around it, starting the Battle of Kola. They attacked on the other side of the vast lake Lagoda that bordered the Karelian Isthmus. Here, the Finns were at a disadvantage with the ground so cold that it was almost impossible to dig in. Determined to break through, the Red Army fired 40,000 artillery rounds in just one day, and launched numerous assaults with tanks and infantry. The only reason they didn't succeed was the sheer heroism of the French defenders. At one defence point, called Killer Hill by the Finns, the Soviets sent an entire regiment against just 32 Finns in fortified positions. 400 Soviets died, along with 28 of the defenders. Famously, when the commander at Kola was asked, "Will Kola hold?" he replied, "Kola will hold." It did. The Soviets would be held here for the rest of the war. Another legend was created at Kola, that of the famous White Death, the sniper Simo Häyhä. From a humble background, he would become the deadliest sniper in world history. In just 100 days, he would kill 505 Soviet soldiers. His highest total for one day was 25 killed. He was aided by the Soviet decision not to send their soldiers white winter camouflage uniforms. Instead, they wore brown uniforms that stood out a mile in the snow. The Soviets were so afraid of him they put a bounty on his head and even launched artillery barrages on areas where they thought he might be. His lethal career was only ended when he was shot with an explosive bullet in the face. He was almost given up for dead until a fellow soldier saw his legs move, saving his life. Given a small farm by a grateful nation, he would live until 2002. Blocked on their main fronts, the Soviets tried to cut Finland in half by invading from the east. While this looked like a great idea on a map, Russia was throwing troops into a region with only a few roads, and a terrain that was split by lakes, rivers, swamps, and almost entirely covered in forest. Here, fighting only local Home Guard soldiers, they would suffer their greatest defeat in the war. A huge Soviet army advanced towards the Finnish town of, and there's no way I'm pronouncing this correctly, Suomussalmi. Yet things were already going wrong. Forced to rely on the only road available, confusion and disorder set in right away. The scouts who were to check the route ahead somehow ended up at the back of the long line of tanks and vehicles. Instead, the army's lead vehicle was a lorry transporting their marching band. On a road perfect for ambush and deep in enemy territory, they were being led by a marching band. Now that's utter chaos. The army became strung out along a 20-mile stretch of road where they could only travel one vehicle at a time. This would prove lethal, as if a vehicle broke down or was destroyed, it would have to be removed before the column behind could move forward. They had plenty of skis, but ironically, they had no men who actually knew how to ski. Morale was also terrible, with one commissar reporting of his soldiers that their faces were sullen, their bodies tired, their spirits low. The Finns descended on the Soviets from the forest, repeatedly attacking, destroying key targets such as their artillery and field kitchens, depriving the Soviets of warm meals in the bitter cold. They then sought to divide the army up into small groups they could encircle. By destroying tanks and trucks strategically, they could cut off whole sections of the army and then surround them, their fellow soldiers unable to help them. Soon the whole army was under siege as the Finns surrounded each group, constantly sniping and attacking to deny the Soviets any real rest. A Soviet officer reported that his battalion had been badly punished when they had lit fires to warm themselves and heat food. From the treetops the Finns machine-gunned every fire, easily picking out the dark silhouettes of the men against the snow. Though still outnumbering the Finns, the Soviets began to believe it was they who were outnumbered. The Finns seemed to be everywhere, hitting them with sniper attacks, 5-minute mortar barrages, and nighttime ski raids that kept them awake and exhausted. Every time a Finnish sniper fired a bullet, panic-stricken Soviets would fire everything they had for as long as 15 minutes, causing no casualties but wasting vital ammunition. The long, dark nights and the deep forests added to the fear they felt. As one commissar who survived said, "All was terribly unreal. I thought of the haunted forests of the fairy tale of boyhood. I was very nervous, but tried not to appear so. I looked at the faces of Nikolaev and the driver. They were ashen." The Finns themselves seemed almost superhuman. Such was Soviet fear that one Finnish officer was able to drive off 2 Soviet tanks by charging at them while firing his pistol. They assumed it was some sort of trick and fled. Probably the only time someone with a pistol has defeated multiple tanks. A sergeant who had been shot in the lung asked to stay on the front lines, claiming it was easier to breathe with 2 holes in his chest. A lieutenant named Rimas took a bullet to his hand and left his unit to head to an aid station. He never arrived. The next day they found his body deep in the woods, surrounded by 6 dead Russians. He had run into a Soviet patrol, but he had taken them all with him. Unable to break out and starving to death, the Soviet commander declared it was every man for himself. Out of an army of over 30,000 men, 27,500 died, with the rest taken prisoner. Only 100 managed to reach the safety of the Soviet Union, most of them commissars who had torn off their insignia as they ran away. Viewing the thousands of frozen Russian dead bodies, a Finnish officer remarked, "The wolves will eat well this winter." Capturing vast amounts of Soviet weaponry, the Finns also came across some oddities. They found dozens of leather-plated whips sewn with ball bearings for the commissars to encourage their troops with, and also a large haul of pornography. That's precisely what you need when you're going to war in the remote countryside. By the end of December, the Finns appeared to have won the Winter War against all the odds. The Soviet advance had stalled in the south, and its armies had been destroyed in the east, while tens of thousands of their soldiers lay dead. The Soviet propaganda machine became increasingly desperate in explaining the failures of Soviet arms. The Menahem line was turned from a job mostly done on the cheap to a barrier 20 times more formidable than the French Maginot Line, an absurd exaggeration. It also claimed that thousands of America's best pilots had been sent to Finland. Also, never happened. The Finns briefly became the toast of the Western world, with the Times of London praising them as fighting with the heroic loyalty characteristic of a free people when its liberty is at stake, while Winston Churchill famously said, "Finland, alone, in danger of death. Superb, sublime Finland shows what free men can do." The Soviet Union was expelled from the League of Nations, the predecessor of the United Nations, though, to be fair, it was practically a dead letter at this point anyway. Former US President Herbert Hoover formed a Finnish relief fund to aid the embattled nation's civilians and refugees, raising $2 million in just 2 months. Volunteers from North America and Europe travelled to Finland to fight, just like we've seen in modern-day Ukraine. Interestingly, at this point, Britain and France almost became involved in the war in a bizarre twist. They were already at war with Nazi Germany, but the Western Front had remained quiet as the 2 powers dithered over what to do. Called the Phony War, nothing would happen until later in 1940, when Hitler's armies turned west. While already at war with a major power that they seemed frightened to take the initiative with, the French and British leaders suddenly leapt on the idea of sending munitions and even an expeditionary force to help the Finns fight the Soviets. This would have led to the Allies fighting both the Soviet Union and the Germany at the same time. A pretty scary thought with unimaginable consequences for the future. Why were they considering this harebrained scheme? On one hand, to those in power who were scared to fight Germany, they seemed to prefer the idea of fighting the Soviet Union instead. On the other, there were also strategic reasons at play. To get the troops and munitions to Finland, they would need to use the Norwegian ports of Trondheim or Narvik, which could then be seized, and they could cut off the vital iron ore deliveries to Germany from both Norway and Sweden. The main reason the scheme failed is Norway understood this, and threatened to fire on any foreign naval ships that went near these ports. So it's a bit of a lucky escape there for France and Britain, if I'm honest with you. It was almost like a fairy tale for the Finns, But their leadership understood that this was real life. Sooner or later, the Soviets could wear them down through sheer numbers without foreign help or negotiations. Now the second part of the Winter War began. Embarrassed by Soviet failures, Stalin sacked Voroshilov and brought in a new, more capable commander to run the invasion, General Timoshenko. Some of the officers who'd been purged were also released from the prison camps in Siberia and allowed back to their old positions. The army was reorganized and retrained. A new plan was drawn up to focus solely on breaching the Mannerheim line, and most importantly of all, huge amounts of artillery were brought to the front lines. While the army rebuilt itself, the Finnish defences were relentlessly bombarded to soften them up. During daylight hours, the Finns took shelter inside their fortifications from the bombardments and repaired damage during the night. The situation led quickly to war exhaustion among the Finns, who lost over 3,000 soldiers in this period. On February the 1st, 1940, the Soviets unleashed hell. 300,000 artillery shells were fired on the first day alone, while 600,000 soldiers were launched against the Mannerheim line. The Soviets were still terribly profligate with their men's lives, diverting fire from their tanks by using large groups of soldiers to divert Finnish fire. They took horrific casualties, but eventually, after 10 days, the line was breached. While Soviet honour had been somewhat regained, Stalin was looking for an exit from this conflict. It had become an embarrassment for the Soviet Union, and more importantly, for Stalin himself. It was costing too much for too little gain, and with the spring thaw on its way, the invasion force risked getting bogged down in forests and impassable roads. He was ready to negotiate if he was given what he wanted. Let us head to the peace conference in Moscow on the 12th of March 1940. You are the Finnish delegates on the day the treaty is signed. You look at the glum faces of your fellow delegates after such magnificent resistance for 105 days, and such great victories. The sacrifices the treaty calls for are a bitter pill to swallow. 11% of Finnish territory ceded to Russia. 500,000 of your people are about to become refugees. You glance at the Russians, expecting to see them triumphant. Yet, really, they just look tired and glad this is over. For all of you, the last 3 months have seemed more like 3 decades. A familiar face comes into view. A balding man with a huge grey moustache. Your president, Kyösti Kallio. He sits at the table and stares at the treaty as though he wants it to burst into flames. Finally, he looks up and says, "And may my hand, which is forced to sign such a paper, wither." And then he signs the treaty. The war is over. As if he was uttering a prophecy, Kallio's right arm was paralysed by a stroke shortly after, and he had to switch his writing hand. Though the Soviets had won, it was something of a Pyrrhic victory for them. They had taken 600,000 casualties, with 120,000 to 200,000 killed in action. One Soviet general, looking at a map of the territory Russia had acquired, is said to have remarked, "We have won just about enough ground to bury our dead." Future Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev later recalled, "All of us, and Stalin first and foremost, sensed in our victory a defeat by the Finns. It was a dangerous defeat, but it encouraged our enemy's conviction that the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay." The Soviet Union's poor performance would convince another apex predator that it was weak. All he would need to do is just kick the door in, and the whole rotten structure would collapse. The Winter War was the final proof Adolf Hitler used to persuade his generals that an invasion of the Soviet Union would be easy. He would have help as well. The embittered Finns would be easy prey for his promises of revenge and restoring their lost lands. Without the Winter War, they probably would have stayed out of World War II. Instead, Stalin brought about the very thing he claimed to fear when starting the invasion. With German help, the Finns invaded and helped the Nazis besiege Leningrad, a period called the Continuity War by the Finns. When the tide turned after Stalingrad, many in the West thought Finland would be doomed, along with all the other Nazi allies. Yet the legacy of the Winter War, and especially the influence of Marshal Mannerheim, saved them once more. Stalin was reluctant to waste more men, time and resources in the endless forests of Finland. In exchange for losing more territory and kicking out the Germans, Finland would remain free. It was rare for Stalin to respect someone, yet he seems to have had a healthy respect for Mannerheim. When signing the new Soviet-Finnish peace treaty in 1947, Stalin told a Finnish delegate, "You owe much to Marshal Mannerheim, more than you know." While the Finns lost the Winter War, their heroic resistance saved their nation from becoming yet another part of the Soviet Empire. It also gives us a fascinating insight into Russia's performance in wars. Like the British, they often start wars terribly, yet improve and learn as the war progresses. We have seen the same in Ukraine after Russia's disastrous original invasion. The pattern just keeps on going. Before I go, I just want to share one more fascinating fact about the Winter War. The Finn who fought for free countries, fighting first for the Finns in the Winter and Continuity Wars. When Finland was eventually knocked out of World War II, he joined the Waffen-SS and continued to fight the Soviets on the Eastern Front, where he eventually surrendered to the British. After numerous prison escapes and adventures, he was eventually pardoned and found his way to the United States, where he joined the army and changed his name to Larry Fawn. After decorated service, he would die in the Vietnam War in 1965. The Finns of this era were truly made of amazing stuff. I have to admit, after researching this, I'm glad Finland is now part of NATO. If you enjoyed the podcast, please leave a rating, a review, or tell a friend. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.
Снова готовят нам царский трон, но Алтаида британских морей. Красная армия всех сильных, так пусть же красная, сирает классная, площадь мозолей, старый стрелкой. И все должны жить, неудержимо, идти в последний звездный бой. Так пусть же красная, сирает классная, площадь мозолей.